Drogon soared east, wings stretched wide against a bruised sky, carrying with him the memory of a fallen queen. The salt in the wind reminded him of distant battles and raging fires, the same air once thick with the tang of ash and dragon flame. His great heart thudded in a tireless beat, his serpentine neck craning toward the horizon, as if guided by an unspoken call. He had left Westeros behind in a storm of grief, the gentle weight of Daenerys Targaryen's lifeless form once draped across his claws. Now her body was gone to dust, and the ghosts of kings and queens stood behind him. What remained was a primal yearning, an instinct throbbing in his blood for lands where the skies were vast, and the seas wide, where dragons had once ruled in glory. Wind whipped along his leathery wings as the coast of Essos rose into sight, shimmering like the edge of a sword beneath the late-day sun. He remembered these lands from the time he was smaller, when he knew only the taste of fresh game and the trusting hand of his mother. But he had grown large and fierce, forged by war and heartbreak, shaped into a shadow of destiny that had died with Daenerys. Nobody waited on the shore with open arms. The wide dunes of a desert to the north rolled into the horizon. The broken shells of ancient cities rose in the distance, testaments to the millennia-old tapestry of civilization that had witnessed dragons vanish once before. The only greeting Drogon found was in the swirl of wind and the roil of the tide, how it all recognized something primal in him. He circled high, scanning the beaches below for anything living. Herds of goats or wild horses, even men who might cower at his silhouette crossing the sun. But as the day waned, only the emptiness of a desolate strand greeted him. The only movement below came from waves lapping over rocks and the flicker of shadows in tide pools. He landed upon a stretch of wet sand, his claws sinking with a faint hiss. He roared, but it was a cry that echoed only across the dull glass of the sea. No voices rose in answer, no valiant war cry of the Dothraki, no hushed reverence of freed slaves. That era was gone, and he was an echo of its glory. He turned inland, drawn by the sense of open space, reminiscent of the endless grass sea where the stallion lords once rode. He needed to hunt. Great as he was, his hunger too was immense, a mighty furnace that demanded satisfaction. Each stride carried him past dunes of sand and low shrubs. He walked for hours beneath the falling sun, the hiss of the desert wind tugging at the spines along his neck. The world around him seemed empty of men and armies, full of only the hush of twilight and the distant caw of carrion birds. Night fell, star-strewn and quiet, except for the soft rasp of his own breathing. Drogon found a spot among a circle of rocky outcroppings, the stone warm from the day's heat. There he curled, great wings folding around him like a cloak of black leather. His thoughts were not those of men, but they carried deep emotion nonetheless, echoes of a bond severed by betrayal and steel. Sleep hovered at the edge of his senses, heavy and inexorable. The night pressed on, and with it came dreams that teased the old flame of memory. Images of a small silver-haired woman guiding him through the sky, her laugh carried by the wind. And in that dream, there were whispers of something new, some ancient presence calling him back. He did not understand it, but he felt the pull as surely as he felt the strength in his powerful limbs. The riddle was in his blood, singing out with every beat of his heart. When dawn arrived in a cool, pale light, Drogon opened his eyes and rose to his full height. Hunger gnawed at him. He spread his wings and took flight again, resolved to find whatever game could ease the pain in his belly. He soared over parched landscapes, over gullies and ridges, scanning for movement. At last, he spotted a scuttling shape below, a group of gazelle-like creatures bounding through scrub. With a swift dive, he plummeted to the earth, talons extended. Their shrieks cut short as he claimed his prey, a necessary brutality of nature. He devoured them in minutes, blood staining the sand a dark crimson that gleamed under the sun. When he was done, he lifted his head, glaring with those burning eyes at the horizon. Everything in him urged him to go deeper, further into the continent. So he did. For days, he traveled across arid plains and rocky highlands, through dryness broken only by the murmur of hidden oses. He kept to the sky mostly, letting the hot drafts bear him aloft, scanning for more water and prey. And in these days he found traces of men, burnt-out campfires, the bones of caravans, tattered flags left behind by traders who had braved a route too dangerous for the faint of heart. But none saw him, and he saw no living soul. It was an absence that made the lonely ache in him grow. He did not desire their friendship, for men had once cost him everything, but the emptiness of the land reminded him of all that had been lost. The swirl of color in the markets of Marine, the ring of voices, the hush of kneeling crowds. On the fifth day, he saw a single figure on the edge of a rocky crag, a traveler cloaked against the sun's punishing light. Drogon descended with caution, unsure if he wished to engage. The traveler watched him land, making no move to flee. He appeared young but weathered, his tunic bleached by sun and sweat. Drogon's snarl reverberated in the still air, and the traveler took a trembling step back but did not run. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to his knees, bowing his head. Drogon hissed. He did not sense deception from this mortal, merely awe and fear. Finally, the man dared to look up, eyes wide. Then he spoke a single phrase, in an Essos dialect. Drogon did not know men's words, but he sensed that the traveler invoked reverence, something akin to worship. Without a sound, Drogon beat his wings and rose, kicking up sand. He did not look back, but even in flight, he felt the man's astonished gaze trailing him, as if hoping the dragon would bring some new dawn. Drogon continued north, drawn by an invisible chain forging his path. More days bled into nights. The land softened into grass and rolling hills. He saw fewer dunes, more steppes, and wide-reaching plains. The air turned cooler, the nights crisp, reminiscent of another place, another time. His hunts grew more plentiful, herds of wild animals offering themselves to his might. No walls or fortresses barred his path, and so he flew onward, guided by ancestral instincts older than even the Valyrians, older than the memory of men. In quiet evenings, he dozed near meager streams or in the ruins of stone structures whose purpose had long been lost. The ghosts of Essos seemed to swirl around him. It was in such a ruin, a collapsed temple with broken columns and a roof open to the moon, that he felt the shift. There was a stirring in his bones, a crackle in the air. The world felt charged with something more than just wind and moonlight. His ears twitched at the faintest sound. A distant hiss, a flutter of movement. He turned his massive head, black eyes scouring the darkness, but saw nothing. The sensation, however, remained, a silent hum beneath his scales. He pressed on the next day, expecting the feeling to recede, but it grew stronger with each wing beat. It guided him as if by silent command, urging him across hills strewn with hidden brooks, across lonely roads seldom traveled by men. The call in his blood built like a storm, and Drogon answered, forging a path deeper into the unknown, where no banners flew and no throngs gathered. The intangible presence felt older than ancient, primal as the fire in his belly, resonating with the promise of a hidden secret. He recognized it, in the way he recognized the rush of flame in his throat. It was an echo of what he was, a memory of a lost age when dragons soared across these skies, free and unchallenged. His flight took him to an inhospitable region where mountains reared like jagged teeth. Rocky passes snaked through cliffs, and the wind howled in treacherous gusts that tore at his wings. Yet he pressed on, letting the faint call guide him into a dark valley ringed by spires of stone, their peaks crowned with clouds. In that valley not a bird stirred. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. As he descended, the hush grew oppressive, the sense of a great power slumbering just beneath the surface. He landed on a plateau of cracked earth, the tips of his claws scraping against sharp rocks. A rancid smell hung in the stagnant breeze, an odor of sulfur. His eyes flickered with guarded curiosity. This place reeked of old energies, reminiscent of the stories of Valyria, where hot vents in the earth breathed steam and brimstone. Under the midday sun, he prowled the plateau, occasionally growling at the swirling dust devils that rose in the gloom. Then, on a patch of earth near a crumbling rock face, something glimmered faintly in the filtered light. Drogon rumbled low in his throat and approached. The glimmer was embedded in the stone, half covered by ash and debris. An egg, large as a man's head, pearlescent with swirling streaks of onyx and gold. His breath caught in his throat. He stretched his neck forward, sniffing. The egg smelled old. So old that it carried memories of an era lost to myth. Carefully, though his talons could crush steel, he nudged the egg from its bed. Dust rose around it in a choking cloud. His heart thudded with recognition. This was not just a stone ornament but a dragon's egg, slumbering through the ages. For a moment, he expected it to be cold, inert. But as soon as his snout pressed against its shell, he felt the faintest pulse of life, a spark, a living warmth. He blinked, leaning back. Across the valley, a soft hiss sounded, stirring the stagnant air. He turned, wings half spread. A shadow detached itself from the rock face, a shape that glided on all fours with surprising speed. Another presence? Another egg? He advanced warily, nostrils flaring. Yet what moved was no egg, rather a reflection of light on another object, something half buried in the ash. He approached it, and there in the rock's crevice, he found not one, but several eggs, nestled like sleeping beasts in the womb of the stone. 6 or 7, he could not tell at first, the lumps partially covered by dark soot. Each shell had a distinct sheen, a mosaic of colors. Some deep red, some pale green, others dull bronze. He hovered above them, trembling. A swirl of heat washed over him, rising from vents in the rock below. This land was no mere valley. It was a hidden cradle of old magic, an echo of the might that once allowed dragons to thrive beyond measure. With care, Drogon tapped one of the shells. Again, that tiny, pulsing warmth. Still alive, against all odds. Instinct told him to guard them, to keep them warm and safe. The memory of Daenerys' voice flickered through him. How she once tended 3 eggs that seemed like cold, useless stones. Her fire had awakened them. Her grief and love had nursed them into new life. She was gone now, but her legacy whispered in Drogon's mind. Even if men had torn her from him, these eggs might bind him to a future unforeseen. He roared, the sound echoing off the cliffs. Dust fell in dislodged clumps, as if the mountains themselves trembled at the promise of dragonkind reborn. For many days, Drogon stood sentinel over the nest. He hunted in the surrounding mountains, tearing apart wild goats and lean mountain cats to fill his belly. He drank from hot springs, the sulfur-laced water sizzling under his heat. His presence drove away predators, for who would dare approach the valley when a black-winged shadow circled overhead like the scythe of doom? At night, he curled around the eggs, letting his body's warmth and the roiling heat from the earth cradle them. He coiled around them protectively, not once daring to leave them for long. The fires in his belly glowed. Sometimes, in the darkness, he felt tiny vibrations tremor through the shells, faint as a heartbeat. Their time was not yet. The old songs had taught him that dragons' eggs need the perfect moment, the precise alignment of flame and fury. Still, he watched them, a tireless guardian, remembering how his mother had once been. Yet the valley did not remain his alone. On the 15th day of his vigil, Drogon sensed a presence, a whiff of human sweat on the breeze. His reptilian eyes narrowed into slits. Men had found their way here. He lifted his head, scanning the cliffs until he saw them, a handful of figures picking their way through a narrow pass. Their clothes were ragged, their steps cautious, carrying spears or curved blades. They stopped short at the sight of him, half concealed by the gloom but unmistakably massive. One man swore loudly in an Eastern tongue. Another dropped to his knees, face buried in the dust. Others raised weapons in trembling hands. Drogon bared his fangs in a silent snarl, issuing a low rumble that made their bones quake. He could have ended them there and then. In the past, he might have. Memories of betrayal, of men's cunning, still stung, but something in him paused. The men did not advance further. They knelt or they retreated. 2 turned and ran in blind terror. Another prostrated himself, pressing his forehead to the rock. The final pair stood frozen, spears raised, as if in a feeble attempt at defense. Then one carefully set his spear down. The moment hung in time, the hush so profound that even the wind seemed to vanish. The man placed a hand to his chest and bowed his head. Drogon's nostrils flared as he listened for the slightest hint of threat. He saw no cunning glint in their eyes, only raw fear and a measure of awe. A memory fluttered through him. Daenerys standing before a horde of frightened people, her eyes filled not with malice, but with determination to free them. Had she not taught him to be more than a beast of war? Men still remained men, easily swayed by fear. But some had once believed in dragons as symbols of hope and rebirth. He snorted a burst of hot air. The men waited. Slowly, Drogon retreated, stepping away from the eggs to show the watchers exactly what he safeguarded. Their eyes widened, reflecting the glimmer of the shells. One gasped, uttering a prayer or curse. None dared move closer. He turned his back on them, resuming his vigil, a silent challenge. Approach if you dare. But they did not. After several tense moments, the men backed away, leaving small offerings on a flat rock. Bits of dried meat, a clay vessel of water. Whether they intended it as tribute or bribe, Drogon neither knew nor cared. They retreated the way they had come, and when they were gone, the only sound that remained was the hiss of wind over stone. Later, under a moon bright enough to wash the valley in a pale glow, Drogon rose and investigated the offerings. The dried meat was old, tough to chew, but edible. He ate it in 2 bites, the water he left alone. For a moment he thought how men once fed him scraps, when Daenerys had first gained a foothold in this vast continent. It felt like another lifetime. The next day brought more humans, cautiously creeping along the pass. They carried little banners, ragged cloth etched with symbols unknown to him. Perhaps a local tribe, perhaps an old sigil from some petty warlord. They did not appear armed for a fight, though some had daggers. Again they brought offerings. Salted fish, clay urns of fresh spring water, even a handful of small coins that glittered in the dust. Drogon hissed at their approach. The men halted, set down their gifts, and backed away. Word had spread. The black dragon had returned, nesting in a hidden valley. Hope or dread, they came to see if the tales were true. Over the week that followed, more came, all bearing tributes. They kept their distance, for his fiery gaze was enough to deter foolish bravery. Sometimes, the visitors lingered on the outskirts of the valley, setting up small tents. He heard their low voices carrying in the wind. He saw them gesture toward the eggs, mouths agape. Some nights, strange chanting drifted across the valley. Prayers to old gods for blessings or curses. Drogon did not know or care. His only concern was the safety of the clutch. The eggs grew warmer each day. He felt them shifting within, the stir of life that would soon need more than heat. They needed flame, an awakening like the one that had birthed him, Rhaegal and Viserion. In the old days, Daenerys had walked into a pyre. Drogon had not the will nor the means to conjure such a conflagration without risking everything. He remembered the heartbreak of seeing his siblings fighting by his side, only to lose them to men's contraptions. It could not happen again. A month passed, and the Watchers multiplied. Their small camp at the valley's edge turned into a larger encampment, tents and rough huts forming in the shadow of the cliffs. A trickle of travelers became a steady stream. They called themselves pilgrims, or so Drogon imagined. They came from scattered corners of Essos. Some from the coasts, some from inland caravans. He smelled the salted sweat of seafarers, the dusty musk of desert wanderers. They were building a settlement dedicated to him, or perhaps to the myth of Dragon's return. Above them soared vultures in lazy arcs, ready to feast on the weak or the dead. Yet the camp seemed to survive off the local game and the bounty of hidden springs. They never approached too close. Any who did found Drogon's teeth bared in warning. A careful balance settled over the valley, the mighty dragon on one side, the fervent watchers on the other. Still, men were men. Whispers carried in the night that some prayed for the eggs to hatch and bring a new age. Others conspired, lured by the promise of capturing a living dragon to harness power. But no open threat emerged yet. Any would-be usurpers trembled at the sight of Drogon's black wings spanning half the sky. They had no scorpions here, no ballistae, no illusions of grandeur that might lead them to challenge the last known living dragon. And Drogon watched them, cunning in his own right, learning their patterns. He recognized the ones who meant him no harm, the ones who left generous offerings and bowed low. He also marked those whose eyes lingered too long on the nest, whose hands never strayed far from their blades. One evening, near sunset, he sensed a change. A new tension in the valley, a crackle in the air, similar to the one he felt upon discovering the eggs. He listened to the murmurs of the camp, the hurried footsteps. From a ridge above, a group of riders arrived, 8, maybe 10, wearing strange, mismatched armor. Their horses snorted in fear. The watchers parted for them. These riders seemed more formidable than the pilgrims, more used to violence. Drogon smelled steel and blood on them. The newcomers peered down at the valley, eyes keen on the nest. A tall figure in the lead, face obscured by a cloth wrap, raised a hand to hush the chatter behind him. Drogon rumbled a warning. The riders stiffened, uneasy. The hush spread across the encampment like a plague. Even the wind died down. For a heartbeat, it seemed violence would spark. But then the tall figure dismounted, removing his cloth wrap. His features were sharp, his hair close-cropped. He approached the valley floor, alone, leaving the others behind. Step by step, he came closer, ignoring the wide-eyed warnings of the pilgrims, until he stood just beyond the ring of scorched earth where Drogon's flame had charred the ground earlier that day. He bowed slightly, hand over heart. Then he spoke in a soft, firm voice, echoing off the cliffs. Drogon did not understand the words, but the tone was strangely earnest. The tall man produced an object from within his cloak, a piece of old chain, tarnished and partially melted. He held it up for Drogon to see. Then slowly, he laid it on the ground and stepped back. The hush deepened. Drogon tilted his head, uncertain. The chain smelled of old metal, singed by dragon flame. Perhaps. A wave of recollection stirred, reminding him of the freed slaves once symbolized by broken chains. Had Daenerys not heralded the breaking of chains? Another memory flickered, visions of the unsullied. The freed men and women chanting Missa. The tall man's eyes brimmed with awe, or fear, or perhaps reverence. He knelt in the dust and spoke again, in an almost pleading tone, gesturing to the encampment, to the eggs, to the chain. Finally, he bowed his head low, pressing his forehead to the ground, waiting as if for judgment. Drogon inhaled deeply, a resonance building in his throat. He could burn this man to ashes. Yet something about the chain and the posture of the man awakened a glimmer of empathy. What if, like so many before him, he sought deliverance, not conquest? Some men had turned to Daenerys for salvation, for a new life. Was this so different, or was it merely another entreaty from a mortal hoping to exploit dragons? Drogon shifted his weight, eyeing the figure. Slowly, the tall man rose, giving Drogon a long, searching look. A quiet acceptance passed between them, though neither fully understood the other. Then the tall man turned, walking back to his horse. The watchers let out a collective sigh. The tension ebbed. The riders left the valley as quickly as they'd come, a swirl of dust marking their departure. Night fell, heavy and reflective. Drogon wondered if, in some distant dream, Daenerys could sense what was happening here. Did her spirit linger, guiding him? Or had her life's flame been quenched beyond recall? He felt the quiet crackling of the eggs, as if they whispered secrets. Perhaps her legacy lived on through them. He curled around the clutch, exhaling a faint wisp of flame into the air. Warmth rippled from his scaled flank, lulling the eggs into deeper slumber. He drifted into a half-sleep, attuned to every sound in the valley, every voice in the encampment. In the distance, men sang lullabies in tongues he did not know. A child cried, and a mother hushed it gently. A drunken argument flared, then died as quickly as it came. So life continued in the shadow of the Black Dragon. Time slipped by, unmeasured by men's calendars, only by the rhythms of the eggs. Drogon roamed the skies in search of prey, scaring up flocks of birds that scattered in panic. He returned each night to the valley, sometimes finding new offerings laid at the perimeter. The Watchers built more structures, fortified them with timbers gathered from distant forests. Still, none dared cross the boundary between them and the nest. Until one dawn, a lone figure ventured past the line. Small and slight, it was a child, no more than 10. She carried a clay bowl in trembling hands, stepping gingerly over the scorched earth. Drogon raised his head, eyes narrowing. The child shook with terror, but she kept walking. When she reached a point some 20 feet from him, she set the bowl down. A thin column of steam rose from it, the smell of freshly cooked grain. Her eyes flicked up to his for the briefest moment before she bowed in imitation of the tall rider's posture. Then she scurried away. Drogon watched her go, feeling the faint stirring of curiosity. He stretched his neck forward, sniffing. The food was meager, but freshly prepared, and the scent told of the Watcher's desire to please rather than harm. He flicked out his tongue, tasting the steam. He did not truly need the men's offerings, but something about their tribute made him recall the time when he and his siblings were small, when Daenerys would feed them scraps from her hunts or from the markets of Korth. A pang of longing cut through him, but he did not show it. He ate the grain, swallowing it in a gulp, then lay back down. Later that same day, the tall rider returned. This time he came with a dozen men, some armed, some not. They laid more gifts: jugs of wine, crates of dried fish, and pouches of spices. Then, through gestures and careful steps, they showed they wished to come closer, perhaps to behold the eggs. Drogon hissed in warning, wings twitching. The men halted. The tall rider placed a hand on his chest, bowing again. Bit by bit, inch by inch, he advanced. Arms spread to show he had no weapon in hand. Drogon's tail lashed, stirring up plumes of dust. The men froze, the tension building. But Drogon did not strike. The tall rider reached a spot where he could see the eggs. He stared in wonder, reverence dancing in his eyes. He uttered soft words or prayers. With a trembling hand, he brushed a fist to his forehead. Another man behind him did the same. Then they bowed and retreated, never taking their eyes off Drogon. That night, the valley was alight with fires from the encampment. Men and women danced around flames, chanting, calling out to old gods or new. The Watchers found in Drogon and the eggs a symbol, a stirring of ancient power. Some sought guidance. Others prayed for vengeance against their oppressors. Whispers in the wind carried tales of the Dragon Queen, her conquests, her downfall, and how her surviving dragon had now returned to resurrect a lost empire. They spun fables to each other, stories of how a new age would dawn with the hatching of these eggs, how the might of Valyria reborn would sweep aside petty tyrants and slavers. Drogon listened from his perch on a high ledge above the nest, silhouette cutting across the moon. Their words meant little to him. He cared only for the unborn dragons. And yet, deep in his chest, something thrummed, an echo of what Daenerys had fought for. Freedom? A world delivered from cruelty. Could these Watchers, these pilgrims, truly bring about something new and better? Morning dawned on a shift in the eggs, an unmistakable quiver that rippled through all of them. Drogon lowered his snout, hearing the faint scratches from within the shells. The time was near, but not yet. They needed more warmth, more flame. He felt the pull in his belly, a fierce swirling of power. The Watchers outside the ring sensed it too. A hush fell over their camp. The child who brought the grain rushed to her mother's side, pointing. Men dropped to their knees. The tall rider, newly arrived at the perimeter, watched with solemn expectation. Drogon inhaled, and smoke streamed from his nostrils, dancing in the morning light. He spread his wings wide, blocking out the sun, and roared with all the fury and majesty in him. The valley shook with the sound. Fire erupted from his jaws, bathing the eggs and the earth around them. Intense and focused, the flames coiled over the shells, but did not consume them. The Watchers cried out, recoiling from the heat. Drogon sustained the fire, feeding it with the depth of his lungs, recalling how Daenerys had once walked into the pyre of Khal Drogo. Smoke billowed. The ground cracked under the heat. For a moment, the eggs were lost in a blaze of gold and orange. a conflagration that roared as loud as a tempest. Then Drogon withdrew, the flames subsiding, leaving molten rivulets on the rocks. The eggs glowed red-hot steam, rising in ghostly tendrils. Silence fell. Even the wind seemed too frightened to blow. A crack. Then another. The watchers gasped, pressing forward to the edge of the scorch. Drogon crouched low, eyes transfixed. A spiderweb of fractures split the onyx swirl of the first egg. From within came a tiny squeal, fragile yet fierce. A shard broke away, revealing a sliver of scaled hide glistening in the smoky air. The watchers murmured. Some fell prostrate, others covered their mouths in disbelief. Drogon inched closer, mindful of the hatchling's frailty, remembering his own emergence into the world. Another crack split the hush, then another. Across the nest, shells shattered in miniature bursts, revealing newborn dragons of varied hues: dark red, pale green, burnished bronze. Their thin limbs trembled, wings too weak to spread fully. Their eyes fluttered open, second-born to a father who was once a child of prophecy. The watchers wept openly, or sang, or bowed their faces to the dirt, chanting about the dawn of a new age. Drogon gazed upon his hatchlings, a mixture of primal satisfaction and an emotion akin to wonder. One hatchling, with scales of shimmering black, stumbled toward him, chirping a plaintive note. He lowered his head, gently brushing its snout with his own. A faint thrill passed between them. That bond, once shared with Daenerys, found a new spark in these fledglings. The other hatchlings squirmed free of their shells, squealing hungrily, eyes blinking in the smoke-drenched air. Drogon exhaled a soft huff of warmth, enveloping them. From the edge of the encampment, the tall rider slowly approached, followed by dozens more, drawn by the irresistible pull of the miracle unfolding before them. Drogon let them come closer than ever before. For now the watchers beheld something beyond fear and beyond their mortal grasp. They stood at the boundary, hearts pounding, tears shining. 7 small dragons lay in the nest, new life in a world that had seen too much death. Their tiny bodies quivered with the effort of breathing, their heads turning toward the watchers with uncertain curiosity. A hush fell that seemed to stretch across the desert, the mountains, across time itself. Finally, the tall rider dropped to his knees, and one by one, the watchers followed, as if they knelt before gods reborn. They offered no sound except the rustle of cloth against dirt. Drogon eyed them warily. These creatures, his children, were precious, vulnerable. He roared a curt warning, and the watchers cowered. The hatchlings responded with tiny squeaks of their own, echoes of their father's roar, still frail but brimming with raw instinct. There would be many trials ahead, many dangers. Men would yearn to control or kill such power. But for this moment, an almost sacred calm wreathed the nest. Drogon turned his attention back to the hatchlings, carefully nudging them upright, guiding them to stand on wobbly legs. One tried to spread its wings, only to fall on its belly with a squeak. Another hissed, shaking broken shell fragments from its spines. Soft puffs of smoke trickled from their tiny maws, but no flame came yet. They were helpless in many ways, but their hearts were strong, beating with the promise of an ancient line reawakened. Drogon lowered himself, encircling them protectively in the curve of his long tail, letting them nuzzle against his warm scales. As the sun climbed higher, the watchers began to chant, a muted melody that rose like a psalm. Drogon's ear frills twitched at the music. He did not understand the words, but the reverence was unmistakable. Some parted from the throng and attempted to move closer, but Drogon snarled, cautioning them. They halted. The tall rider alone risked a few steps forward. He knelt, arms extended, hands open in a gesture of peace. He offered no spear, no sword. His head bowed. Behind him, the pilgrims sang louder, voices reverberating off the rock walls. The hatchlings peered curiously at the tall rider, but none ventured from beneath Drogon's protective wing. For a time that seemed suspended between day and night, father and children rested, absorbing the watcher's awe and the heat from the land. Drogon's mind drifted to Daenerys, to the lost siblings Rhaegal and Viserion, to the blood spilled in lands across the narrow sea. This moment, fragile as it was, whispered of renewal. 7 small hearts beat beside his own, forging a future neither men nor kings nor queens could fully grasp. The watchers waited in breathless anticipation, uncertain if they bore witness to salvation or doom. Drogon sensed their fear, their hope, the unpredictable swirl of mortal ambition that would inevitably haunt these newborns. But for now, the day was bright, the sky unclouded by war, and the dragons had reclaimed a corner of the world. Eventually, the tall rider retreated, as did the rest, leaving offerings of fresh water and what food they could muster. Night would come, and with it, new questions, new conflicts. Word would spread of the nest's success, and men with sharper weapons and colder hearts might soon arrive. For now, Drogon pressed close to his hatchlings, sharing body heat against the coming evening chill. They needed food, and soon. He would hunt for them, teach them to taste flesh and blood, to strengthen wings that would one day carry them into the sky. As the sun set in a blaze of crimson, painting the valley in fire and shadow, Drogon closed his eyes, listening to the little chirps and hisses of his brood. The watchers continued their chanting at a respectful distance, their torches guttering in the growing dark. Overhead, the first stars blinked into life, a cosmic canopy that had seen dragons come and go across the ages. The hatchlings curled around Drogon's limbs, warmth and breath merging in the gloom. He kept one vigilant eye open, scanning the encampment, ensuring no threat crept closer. This was the beginning of something the world had not seen since Valyria's fall, a nest of living dragons, fathered by the last remnant of a queen's dream. It would not be easy. Men would come, seeking dominion or alliances, forging new legends and stoking old hatreds. But for now, in this cradle of stone and ash, 7 new dragons breathed, defying the centuries of silence that had once banished their kind to dust and memory. Drogon exhaled softly, a final wisp of smoke drifting from his nostrils into the cool night air. In that moment, he felt neither alone nor lost. He felt the thrumming of new life, the primal call that had guided him here, and he knew that in the echoes of his roar, Daenerys' spirit was not so far away. The Watchers' songs rose into a moonlit sky. The fledglings stirred. The valley pulsed with magic, older than men's words, unstoppable as the flame that burned within a dragon's heart. Wa'akei. Morning broke with cool light that crept over the rim of the valley's cliffs. The smell of sulfur lingered in the air, but the crisp breeze carried a subtle freshness from distant springs. Drogon slowly stretched his black wings, careful not to disturb the 7 hatchlings curled around his tail. In the half-light, their small forms rose and fell with each breath, dappled in faint color. A midnight scaled one, half buried under a coppery sibling. A greenish hatchling splayed across a pale bronze clutchmate. Their bodies radiated warmth against the chill, each heartbeat linked to the father who guarded them. He surveyed the encampment from his vantage upon a slight rise. The Watchers had begun stirring, emerging from tents, stoking cookfires, greeting the day with hushed voices. Many paused to offer small prayers, heads bowed toward the nest. Thick plumes of campfire smoke rose into the lightning sky. Some Watchers carried water from a makeshift well at the valley's edge, while others rummaged through crates for supplies. Children clung to their mothers, pointing in wonder at the dark shape of Drogon perched above. Even from a distance, awe shone in their eyes. Yet for all their reverence, a tension simmered. The Watchers were not fools. They knew other factions in Essos would soon hear rumors. A hidden valley with a living dragon and newly hatched brood. Wealthy men would crave that power. Warlords would desire it for conquest. So the Watchers waited for the signs of approaching threats. They had built crude barricades at the valley's mouth, bristling with sharpened stakes. A handful of Watchers stood guard there, armed with spears and shortbows. Their sentry duty was meager, but sincere. They feared for their fragile community, where hope and peril intertwine. Drogon rose, arching his serpentine neck. His hatchling stirred, mewling in protest at the sudden movement of the vast body that had warmed them through the night. The black-scaled one nipped half-heartedly at its father's tail, while the smallest, a pale green creature whose wings bore flecks of gold, tried to scramble atop Drogon's foreclaw. He rumbled softly, inviting them to wake. Each blinked sleepy eyes, gathering the day's first impressions. They had hatched just days ago, yet already they had grown bolder. No longer content to merely lie about waiting for scraps, they ventured short distances from the nest to explore the scorching ground. Their steps were clumsy. They fell often, squeaking in complaint. Still, a hungry curiosity drove them onward. Drogon watched them with paternal vigilance. He offered the occasional grunt of caution when a hatchling tottered near the lip of a volcanic fissure or too close to a jagged outcrop. They chirped back, half obedient, half defiant. He felt their hunger pangs echo in his own belly. Last night, he had eaten lightly, too absorbed in watching over them. Now, in the crisp dawn, he expanded his chest and let out a roar that thundered across the valley, a summons to mark another day of life. The watchers froze, eyes drawn skyward, hearts pounding. Then he swept his wings, launching himself into the cool air, the sudden gust flattening tents and scattering dust devils across the camp. The hatchlings squeaked in alarm at the force of their father's departure, but they settled quickly, huddling together. They could not yet fly, their wings too soft to bear their weight. Their father soared off beyond the cliffs, scanning for prey in the surrounding hills. He smelled wild goats and mountain rams, their musk wafting up from hidden passes. The land beyond the valley brimmed with rugged life, deer scampering across boulder-strewn slopes, hares darting between shrubs. It did not take him long to spot a herd of sturdy wild goats picking their way along a narrow ledge. With a swift dive, he snatched two in his claws, ignoring the terrified bleating. The kill was quick. Blood soaked his talons as he bore the meat back to the nest. The watchers had gathered at the perimeter to witness his return. Many dropped to their knees, while the bolder ones simply stared, hands clasped. Drogon landed near the egg's remains, a circle of blackened earth and scattered shells, then tore the goats into manageable pieces for the hatchlings. The youngsters, drawn by the scent of fresh blood, scrambled with surprising speed. Their squeals rose in a chaotic chorus as they squabbled over morsels. One bronze-scaled hatchling snapped at a green sibling, wrestling away a chunk of flesh. The black one, the largest, hissed in warning, then seized the biggest piece for itself, gulping it down. Drogon let them sort out their own feeding order, stepping in only when the smaller hatchlings risked being trampled by the more aggressive ones. He bared his teeth, a sharp hiss rumbling deep in his throat, and the bigger siblings backed off, allowing the weaker to feed. Watching them feast, he recalled his own early days, how he and his two clutchmates had fought for scraps, always testing strength. It was the way of dragons to challenge each other, forging resilience in the face of scarcity. As they fed, the watchers murmured. Some edged closer to get a better look at the hatchlings. Their wonder was evident, but caution radiated off them. They knew the father's wrath could be swift. No one wished to repeat the tragedies that befell those who once tried to cage or harm dragons. Still, their curiosity was insatiable. Children were lifted on shoulders to peer at the feeding hatchlings, who were now drenched in goat's blood, gnawing at bones that looked enormous compared to their small jaws. When the meal finished, Drogon nudged the leftover scraps aside. The hatchlings sprawled, bellies distended, tongues flicking. A wave of satisfaction coursed through Drogon as he resumed his position, coiling around them in a half-circle that promised security. He settled his gaze upon the watch's camp, meeting the wide eyes of men and women who seemed too nervous to speak. Slowly, their leader emerged, the tall rider from before, the chain-offering man. He approached with deliberate slowness, halting just beyond the scorched boundary. His followers remained behind, but he came alone, head slightly bowed. This time, he carried no tokens of metal or bone. Instead, he raised his empty hands, as though inviting Drogon to observe he bore no threat. The tall rider knelt, pressing a palm to his forehead, then touched the ground. He spoke in quiet, measured tones. Drogon did not understand, yet he caught the note of deference, saw the sincerity in the man's eyes. A hush followed. The rider stayed kneeling for a long moment, as if awaiting a sign. Drogon watched him, unmoving, the hatchlings chirping at his feet. At length, The man slowly stood and gestured to the watchers behind him. They hauled forth crates of fresh supplies, dried meats, sacks of grain, earthen jugs of water. With care, they laid them out on the rocky ground, then retreated. Drogon recognized the pattern. The watchers were offering tribute again, but more systematically. He gleaned a sense of organization in their settlement. They had established a routine of bringing gifts each morning, a practice that might secure peace in the valley. Perhaps they hoped to build favor with the father of dragons, or at least ensure he would not destroy them. With the hatchlings to feed, Drogon found little reason to reject the offerings. He gave a low snort, stirring dust, but made no move to incinerate the watchers. For a few days, this ritual continued. Each dawn, Drogon hunted for fresh meat. Each midday, the watchers laid tribute of grain, water, and fruit near the nest. The hatchlings learned to anticipate these deliveries, chirping eagerly whenever they spotted the humans approaching. They had not yet breathed fire, their bodies still too small, but a faint flicker of heat sometimes shimmered in their throats when they hissed. Their scales hardened gradually, each day shining with more luster. By the second week, the Watchers' encampment expanded. Makeshift wooden walls enclosed a growing cluster of tents, lean-tos, and rough huts. Smoke from cook fires drifted in thick plumes. Livestock pens appeared. Goats, chickens, even a few scrawny cattle brought by caravans that must have heard tales of the Holy Valley. Word spread across the plains and deserts, attracting wanderers who came to see the rebirth of dragonkind. Some brought families and all their worldly possessions, hoping to start anew under the guardianship of a living dragon. Others arrived alone, spurred by curiosity or the faint promise of profit. Every new arrival took one look at Drogon's towering form. The black wings folded over his brood, and felt their hearts quake. Some fell prostrate, muttering prayers. Others simply stood in awe, tears streaming unashamedly down dust-streaked cheeks. The child who once brought the clay bowl came often, creeping a little closer each time. She seemed fascinated by the hatchlings. With quiet steps, she inched forward, setting down morsels of dried fish or small bone trinkets. The hatchlings sniffed these offerings, occasionally nibbling if the food tempted them. The father neither snarled nor roared. The child's innocence posed no threat, and in some hidden corner of his mind, Drogon remembered a gentler presence. Daenerys so fond of children, and so determined to break cruel cycles. By the third week, Watchers began to speak of a new name for the valley. Though Drogon understood none of their words, he sensed the weight of significance when they gestured at him, the eggshells or the nest. They might have been forging a legend, a holy site where the great dragon renewed the fire that once lit the world. Some Watchers knelt before the nest each dawn, arms raised to the sky. Others performed solemn processions at dusk, chanting in languages older than the free cities. The hatchlings watched these rituals curiously, sometimes rearing up on hind legs to peer down at the chanting people. That is not to say all was peaceful. Tensions brewed. Disagreements broke out among the Watchers over resources, over where to build huts, over whose god was truly responsible for the miracle of new dragons. Several scuffles ended with bruises and bloody noses. A handful of Watchers tried to claim leadership of the camp, rallying pockets of supporters behind them, but none dared incite open conflict, while the Black Leviathan loomed above. If a fight erupted near the nest, Drogon would glare, unleashing a warning growl that scattered brawlers in all directions. His presence was the ultimate deterrent. Still, as time went on, the Watchers realized they needed organization. The tall rider, who had first approached Drogon with the broken chain, rose in stature among them. He never brandished a weapon near the nest, never tried to test Drogon's boundaries beyond respectful approaches. Yet in the camp, he commanded an air of authority. When disputes rose, people looked to him to mediate. Nobody knew his exact name or origin. Perhaps he was from one of the distant city-states, or from a tribe in the Red Waste. The Watchers simply called him a word in their dialect that meant something akin to speaker or herald. He became a figure of calm presence, ensuring the Watchers distributed supplies fairly, that none starved while others feasted. Drogon noticed that each evening, before the last rays of sun vanished, the herald came to the valley's center with a small retinue. He bowed to Drogon, who sat perched upon a rocky shelf with his brood. Then he recited some ritual words, a prayer or vow, and left gifts: a cask of water, a basket of vegetables, and sometimes fresh game the Watchers had hunted. Over time, the Watchers set up a ring of torches around the nest's perimeter, illuminating the area when darkness fell. Drogon accepted the glow, for it helped him keep an eye on potential threats. He and his hatchlings still slumbered under the open sky, coiled among the rocks and the lingering heat of subterranean vents. During this period of relative calm, the hatchlings grew larger, their bodies surging with fresh energy. Their wing membranes lengthened, arching gracefully behind them. Their appetites ballooned, prompting Drogon to hunt more often. He ventured farther afield, exploring canyons and rugged bluffs. Sometimes the Watchers followed at a respectful distance, never daring to close in, as if enthralled by the sight of him in flight. When he descended on a herd of wild antelope, they stood on the horizon, silent witnesses to nature's primal dance of hunter and prey. One dawn, as Drogon returned from his hunt, he discovered a cluster of new arrivals gathered anxiously before the camp's barricades. Their clothes bore the markings of a city dweller's life: embroidered hems, bright dyes. A tall woman led them, her face shielded by a fine beaded veil. She brought wagons laden with crates. The Watchers parted to let her pass, curiosity mingling with distrust. The herald approached her, arms extended in welcome, yet wary. She said something that made the Watchers murmur, gesturing toward the nest. Drogon circled overhead, catching bits of movement and tone. He glided lower, a shadow across the entire camp. A hush fell. The woman in the veil gazed up, eyes flashing with excitement, or perhaps greed. Drogon heard her sharp command to the men who accompanied her. They opened a crate, revealing shimmering cloth, golden ornaments, polished gemstones that caught the morning sun. A lavish tribute, more opulent than anything the Watchers had offered. She seemed to believe wealth might buy favor. She walked forward, cloak trailing in the dust, and laid these treasures at the scorched boundary near the nest. Her voice rang out in a strong accent, though Drogon understood none of her words. The Watchers stood aside, uncertain. The woman kept pointing toward the hatchlings, as though wishing to see them up close. Drogon's instincts bristled. He caught a flicker in her expression that he did not trust. She radiated ambition. The hatchlings were resting behind a cluster of boulders, only the tips of their tails visible. They had begun to grow scales that glinted in the early sunlight like polished armor. The sight of them might tempt many a wealthy merchant or cunning lord to dream of harnessing dragonflame. Drogon rumbled a warning from deep in his chest. The woman paused, hands clenched. She forced a smile, bowing with exaggerated grace. But her eyes flicked back to the nest, hungry for more than a mere glimpse. The Watchers observed warily, sensing the tension. The herald stepped forward and addressed the woman, his tone polite but firm, gesturing that she remain where she stood. Her men bristled, exchanging uneasy looks. A few placed their hands on short swords. At once, a score of Watchers in the camp readied themselves too. The woman hissed an order at her retinue, telling them to stand down. She spoke again, voice turning conciliatory. Drogon hovered overhead, wings flaring. He released a short burst of flame that incinerated a nearby rock pile, a demonstration of power to ensure they understood the consequences of any aggression. Screams echoed as Watchers and newcomers alike scrambled back, shields raised in futile reflex. Smoke wafted up in thick plumes, and as the dust settled, the woman lowered her head. She extended her arms in a show of humility, or something akin to it. Her men averted their eyes, cowed for the moment. The tension eased, but a seed of worry took root among the Watchers. If rumors spread far enough, more caravans would come, some with armies to back their claims. The woman, though temporarily chastened, retreated to the camp, setting her lavish crates down as if determined to stay. That evening, she sent emissaries with gifts of spiced wine, sweet pastries, and honeyed figs to the Watchers, apparently hoping to sway them to her side. She set up a large ornate pavilion near the camp's outskirts, displaying gold-stitched banners. Curious Watchers lurked around, uncertain what to make of her presence. Days rolled on. The new arrivals mingled, more caravans trickled in, each bringing its own odd mix of tributes or stolen goods. Some watchers worried that greed and politics would corrode the delicate peace. Others believed a new city might arise, dedicated to the worship of dragons. Between these factions, the herald struggled to maintain order, his once peaceful settlement swelling into a crossroads of hopeful pilgrims, opportunistic merchants, and suspicious wanderers. Meanwhile, Drogon and his brood existed on the fringes of that swirl, both revered and feared. The hatchlings soon took their first uncertain flights, fluttering short distances from rock to rock. Their wings were still too weak for extended flight, but each day they improved, building muscle, learning to glide on thermal drafts. Proud as any sire, Drogon watched them from above, sometimes nudging them upward with a gentle push of his snout when they hesitated at a ledge's edge. They squealed in excitement, flapping furiously. During one such moment, the black-scaled hatchling, the boldest of the seven, managed a half-glide that carried it a good distance across a narrow ravine. It landed awkwardly, tumbling in the dust, but let out a triumphant hiss at its siblings, as if to boast. The others chirped in jealousy or encouragement depending on their temperament. The watchers, seeing these first flights, gasped in collective awe. Some sank to their knees, praising whatever god they believed had granted them this spectacle. Others simply stared, hearts pounding with the realization that these small creatures would soon rule the skies. The tall rider, Harold, attempted to keep potential troublemakers in check. Whenever caravans arrived, he made sure to greet them, explaining through gestures and words that none must cross the nest's boundary. He showed them the scorched earth where Drogon's flames had reduced boulders to melted slag, an unmistakable warning. Most caravans complied, presenting tributes, then setting up camp at a safe distance. Yet rumors abounded of bandits lurking beyond the valley, drawn by tales of wealth and mythical creatures. Whispers spread of slavers from New Kais, warlords from the grasslands, and even a shadowy faction from the remnants of Volantis that dreamed of controlling dragons. As weeks turned to months, the hatchlings gained size, their bodies elongated, sinewy muscles rippling beneath tightening scales. Tiny horns sprouted along their brows, and their claws grew sharper. They devoured game at a ravenous pace. Drogon ranged farther in his hunts, sometimes being gone for half a day. It was during one such absence that the Watchers learned the valley was not as secure as they hoped. A roving band of raiders appeared at twilight, descending from a hidden pass in the mountains. They wore patchwork leather armor and carried cruel-looking blades. Their leader, a scarred man with a missing ear, surveyed the encampment like a vulture eyeing wounded prey. The Watchers scrambled, raising alarms, lighting torches along the barricades. A hush of terror gripped the people. The herald rushed to organize a defense, but his Watchers were poorly armed, their spears more ceremonial than practical. The caravans, too, had a few sellswords among them, but no structured militia. The raiders halted a short distance away, spread out to encircle part of the camp. The leader called out a mocking greeting, demanding access to the treasure they knew lay within. Word had reached them of gold, gems, and a brood of living dragons. They sneered, brandishing torches, as if daring the Watchers to resist. The Watchers formed a shaky line, families huddling behind crates and wagons. Children cried, while mothers tried to hush them. The woman with the veil peered out from her pavilion, face shadowed in the torchlight, calculating how best to preserve her riches. Just as tensions threatened to explode, a roar echoed across the valley, reverberating off the rock walls. The scoundrels flinched, eyes darting skyward. High above, silhouetted by the faint glow of a waxing moon, Drogon soared in on the night wind, an obsidian phantom. He had smelled smoke and heard the raised voices. Rage kindled in his belly. With one mighty sweep of his wings, he descended upon the intruders. The Watchers scattered, ducking behind barricades. Fire erupted from Drogon's jaws, painting the night in fierce orange. Two raiders went up in flames, shrieking as they dropped to the dirt, consumed by the inferno. Others backed away, terror stark in their eyes. Arrows shot skyward in a desperate volley, but they clattered harmlessly off Drogon's scales or hissed past him into the dark. He landed in a thunderous crash, dust and sparks swirling. his monstrous head swinging from side to side. Another blast of fire engulfed a knot of raiders, their screams piercing the blackness. The scarred leader tried to rally his men, yelling for them to stand firm. But the Watchers, emboldened now, surged forward, spears and bows at the ready. They hurled torches and rocks at the raiders, distracting them as Drogon unleashed another torrent of flame. The stench of burnt flesh filled the air. Horses panicked, bolting into the gloom. Chaos reigned for a handful of heartbeats. Then the few surviving raiders broke and ran, stumbling back up the rocky pass. The scarred leader cursed, dragging himself away despite a singed arm. His men followed, disappearing into the night, pursued by echoes of their victims' screams. Dust settled over the devastation. The Watchers stood in stunned silence, the flicker of flames illuminating their shocked faces. Bodies lay strewn near the barricade. Fallen raiders, a few Watchers who had been cut down before Drogon's arrival. A hush swept the camp, broken only by the crackle of dying fires. Drogon hunkered there, chest heaving, black eyes scanning for further threats. For a moment, the Watchers feared he might turn on them next, savage in his fury. But he merely roared his victory to the dark heavens, then stepped back, smoke trailing from his maw. The Watchers broke into murmured prayers, some weeping with relief, others singing softly in gratitude. The herald approached, dropping to a knee before the dragon that had just saved them from slaughter. Many Watchers imitated him, bowing low in reverence. In the aftermath, the camp pulled together to tend the wounded. Cries of pain and the moaning of the injured laced the gloom. The woman in the veil emerged, silently assessing the carnage. She offered coin for a makeshift healer to treat those who had been cut by the raiders' blades. A scribe among her retinue busied himself taking notes, possibly describing the savage might of the black beast he had just witnessed. Drogon withdrew toward the nest. The hatchlings, having heard the chaos, were huddled behind a boulder, squeaking in alarm. He exhaled warm air, soothing them with a rumbling purr. Though some Watchers might attempt to approach in thanks, the father made it clear he wanted no disturbance. He spread his wings in a protective arc, corralling his brood close. Slowly, the valley quieted. Torches burned low. Dawn found the camp still reeling from the raid, but alive. Word of Drogon's intervention spread swiftly. Around midday, more Watchers arrived from distant corners of the steppes, praising the dragon as a divine protector. Others whispered that he was a monstrous weapon, a tool to be exploited, if only they could find the key. The herald's voice carried weight, insisting that no one must approach the nest uninvited or provoke Drogon's wrath. Still, the lingering stench of burned bodies was a sobering reminder of what would happen to those who challenged him. In the days that followed, a grim determination settled over the camp. They reinforced their barricades, set up watchtowers of lashed logs, and posted sentries at all hours. The bodies of raiders were unceremoniously burned in a pyre beyond the valley, their ashes scattered in the wind. A few Watchers who had died were given rites, prayers delivered in hushed tones by a traveling priest who had pitched his tent among them. The air remained tense, but at least for the moment, no new raiders appeared. The hatchlings, oblivious to the politics of men, continued to grow. Their father's timely defense of the camp made them even more secure within the valley. When Drogon flew on longer hunts, Watchers maintained a respectful distance, but they found themselves drawn to the spectacle of the young dragons testing their wings. The black-scaled hatchling, the boldest and largest, began venturing higher and higher, flapping short distances between outcroppings. The others followed suit. Some were hesitant, some driven by sibling rivalry. Sometimes at dusk, they would experiment with their nascent fire. A hatchling would cough, expelling a thin trickle of smoke. Another might manage a fleeting spark. The Watchers gasped in excitement whenever that happened, seeing the future made manifest in these flickering embers. But the hatchlings tired quickly, leaving them to squeak and hiss in frustration. Fire-breathing was no simple feat for creatures so young. One evening, the woman in the veil dared to approach the perimeter again. This time she came alone, without her men. She carried a small brazier in which coals glowed bright. She set it down carefully, removing the veil from her face to reveal high cheekbones, elegant features, and eyes with a calculating gleam. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a handful of green powder, casting it into the coals. A burst of colored smoke blossomed, acrid, pungent. A wave of alarm swept the watchers. Some thought she might be attempting witchcraft or an assassination attempt. They reached for bows and swords, but the woman simply lifted her face, letting the colored smoke swirl around her, a faint smile on her lips. She recited words in a foreign tongue, a mesmerizing chant, never taking her eyes from the nest. Drogon, perched above with his brood, let out a warning hiss. The hatchlings stirred, uncertain. Flickers of green flame danced in the brazier. The watchers muttered uneasily, believing she practiced some dark alchemy. Yet she looked not at them, but at the dragons, her chant growing more fervent. The black-scaled hatchling took an interest, creeping forward to the edge of the nest, blinking at the swirling smoke. It sniffed the air, curious. A thin line of steam curled from its nostrils. Then Drogon moved with startling speed, vaulting down to land between the strange brazier and his offspring. He roared, and the gust of his breath nearly extinguished her coals. She stumbled back, shielding her face. His eyes blazed with menace. For a moment, it seemed he would roast her alive. But the watchers called out warnings and pleas, and she too raised her voice, arms spread in a gesture of supplication. The tension hung like a drawn bowstring. Finally, Drogon unleashed only a short column of flame, scorching the ground in front of her feet. She leapt aside, coughing in the smoke. Her expression turned from smug to chastened. She bowed hastily, spouting more words that might have been apologies. The watchers hovered, torn between relief and anger at her arrogance. She waved a hand to disperse the colored fumes, then backed away, letting the coals die. Whatever ritual she had intended was cut short by Drogon's fury. From that night onward, the watchers muttered rumors of her. That she was a sorceress from Ashai, or a priestess of some obscure fire cult, or an alchemist seeking to harness dragon power. She herself said little, retreating behind the heavy curtains of her pavilion. The watchers gave her a wide berth, suspecting she might unleash curses if angered. Meanwhile, the herald reinforced the rule that no one approached the nest without clear cause and absolute caution. As the moon waxed full, the valley took on eerie beauty. Silver light caressed the rocky spires, and the small settlement glowed with torchlight in the darkness. The watchers, having found a semblance of order, continued their chanting, praising Drogon's guardianship and placing offerings at the boundary. The hatchlings, lulled by the hush of night, nestled around their father, now half again as large as they were at birth. They had begun to test their voices in echoing shrieks that bounced off the cliffs. Some nights they bickered among themselves, nipping tails and flaring wings in mock battles. High above, Drogon felt the subtle shift of the wind, smelled the changing season on the air. Days were growing shorter, nights longer. Winter was no true threat this far south, but the region's climate had its cycles. Storms might come, rains that could turn the valley floor to mud, or colder winds might sweep down from distant mountains. He watched the watchers raise more structures, fashioning partial roofs from timber and woven mats. Some caravans left, uninterested in staying after glimpsing the harsh realities of life here. Others arrived, enthralled by the talk of living dragons. In the midst of this slow but constant flow, a hush settled one dawn when a ragged group of newcomers arrived from the north. They carried battered shields and wore the remains of matching surcoats, now scorched and ripped. Their faces bore a hollow look, haunted by some unseen terror. They claimed to have come from a far-off city, recounting to the camp how entire settlements had been razed by men with cunning crossbows, mercenaries seeking to seize control of land routes. Whether these men or others like them would soon descend upon the valley, none could say. The watchers shivered at the idea of an army bristling with scorpions or other war machines. Memories of how Rhaegal and Viserion had fallen haunted those aware of the stories. Still, in the uncertain gloom of rumor and suspicion, life persisted. Each morning, the hatchlings tested their wings a bit more. Each midday, they sunned themselves on warm rocks, absorbing the day's heat while watchers gazed from afar. By night, they curled up beside Drogon's flank, drifting into infantile slumber. Their presence brought a strange kind of unity to the watchers. No matter what petty feuds brewed or what ambitions smoldered, all recognized the immense power sleeping under the stars. The dragons were an undeniable reality, forging an uneasy alliance among those who lived in the valley's shadow. One late afternoon, as golden light slanted across the jagged cliffs, Drogon soared high with the black-scaled hatchling clinging precariously to his back. In an act of paternal teaching, he flew gentle circuits above the valley, letting the updrafts carry them. The little one screeched in wonder, wings flapping in excitement. It was not truly flying on its own yet, more a passenger in training. The watchers below gasped, pointing, momentarily forgetting their chores. Even the woman in the veil emerged from her pavilion, shading her eyes to watch the father and child drifting over the encampment. For a heartbeat in time, the valley's tensions melted away. All who saw the black dragon carrying his offspring felt the stir of something miraculous, an echo of an age before Aegon's conquest, before the doom of Valyria, when dragons soared in the hundreds across the skies. That long-lost majesty hovered in the air, fueling hope and fear in equal measure. The watchers' hearts beat faster. Some wept, uncertain whether to celebrate or tremble at the future such a sight portended. When Drogon landed, the black hatchling scrambled off, bristling with excitement, bounding clumsily among its siblings as if to share what it had just experienced. Drogon settled on the rocky ledge, breathing slowly, letting the adrenaline of flight recede. He surveyed the watchers, who gradually returned to their tasks, minds buzzing with fresh stories to tell around the evening fires. The sun dipped low, painting the valley in shades of rose and amber. Shadows lengthened. Dusk brought the usual chanting, the watchers lighting torches around the perimeter. The herald oversaw the distribution of food, the feeding of livestock, the organization of the watch. The woman in the veil lingered at the edge of her pavilion, stroking the gold embroidery on her sleeve, eyes fixed on the nest. No one could decipher her ambitions, but they guessed they were as grand as the riches she brought. In the final hush before night fully claimed the sky, Drogon glanced at the 7 hatchlings, now dozing in a contented pile. Each had distinct colorations that grew more vibrant with every passing day. Their breathing rose and fell in a warm pulse of life. The watchers' torches reflected in their scales, transforming them into living jewels. Drogon lowered his massive head, curling around them, his tail forming a barrier between them and the world. He felt the soft brush of night air along his wings, tasted the faint tang of distant storms on the breeze. Far from the intrigues of mortal minds, he remained vigilant, scanning the heavens for signs of disturbance. The watchers believed in him as their protector, but he was also a father, guardian of a precious new generation of dragons who might one day shape the fate of kingdoms. No crown weighed upon his brow, only the unrelenting burden of survival that every creature bears in a dangerous world. Below, the watchers whispered and prayed, the hush of their voices blending with the sigh of wind over rock. The valley's new name, whatever it was, passed softly from lip to lip in reverent tones. Rumors swirled that the pilgrims might build a temple or carve effigies to honor the dragon who had brought them safety from raiders. Others dared to dream of forging an alliance with him and his brood, that they might conquer slavers' cities, champion the downtrodden. But Drogon understood only the timeless imperatives of his kind: protect, hunt, endure, and guide the young into the sky. So the night settled in gentle layers of starlight, each flicker above mirrored in the watchfires below. A precarious peace enveloped the valley, though distant threats lurked just beyond the horizon. For now, father and brood remained together, the watchers keeping their reverent distance, and the hush of possibility hung over them all. The world had changed the moment those eggs cracked open, and the repercussions would ripple across deserts and seas. But in this moment, the dragon slept, and the father watched, content to exist in the lull between storms, waiting for the flames of destiny to burn brighter once more. The morning light drifted through the valley, gilding the rocky spires in a soft glow that slowly chased away the chill of night. A small flock of birds took flight from a distant outcrop, startled by the faint tremor of the ground. They vanished into the vast sky, the flutter of their wings lost beneath a low rumbling growl that emanated from the nest's heart. Drogon stirred. His black scales caught the dawn's first rays, reflecting a dull sheen along his massive flank. Around him, the 7 hatchlings uncoiled, each extending delicate wings. Their growth had become more apparent with each passing day. They could walk farther from the nest, clamber over rock formations, and some had begun to test short glides when no strong gust threatened to topple their uncertain flight. They had learned to breathe thin sputters of flame, just enough to scorch a pile of sticks or singe the edges of raw meat. For all their progress, they still regarded their father as an unassailable force, and the watchers who clustered at the valley's perimeter still regarded him with awe, and perhaps a growing sense of dependence. Below the nest, the encampment stirred. Cook fires and torches had dwindled to embers hours ago, and the watchers emerged from tents and makeshift huts to begin their daily routines. Some hurried to feed their goats or check on small plots of vegetables they had tried to cultivate near a seep of water. Others hauled in crates of new provisions from caravans that had arrived under cover of darkness. Word of Drogon's presence and the miraculous brood had become a beacon, drawing travelers from the lonely deserts, from city-states far away, and from savage steppes where survival was a daily gamble. Beyond the ring of watchfires, the settlement had begun to take on the shape of a small town. Workers hammered wooden posts into the ground, raising simple walls reinforced with mud and dried brush. The watchers believed that, with time, they might carve out a permanent home here, protected by the fearsome shadow of the dragon above. Yet talk of new enemies circulated in hushed voices. More raiders or even armies, men armed with scorpions capable of piercing dragon hide. The watchers were not naive. They knew peace was fragile. Far to one side, the woman in the veil paced near her pavilion of embroidered silk. By now, many in the camp had learned that she came from a distant land of traders, rumored to have connections in Ashai or Korth. No single name had been confirmed. No one knew if she was truly a merchant or a sorceress. Some watchers called her the Veil Lady, others the Whisperer. She allowed them no insight into her real identity, but she bestowed gifts of spices, sweetmeats, and exotic fabrics upon the settlement, earning grudging acceptance. She also paid a handful of sellswords to remain near her pavilion, tall men with shaved heads and suspicious eyes. She gazed up toward the nest, where Drogon and his brood were now fully visible in the early light. Her expression, half hidden behind the translucent veil, glimmered with calculation. The watchers whispered that she had come to bargain for the hatchlings, either to gain a share in their power or to promise them to unseen patrons. Yet she had made no move since the day Drogon nearly blasted her brazier into oblivion. Some suspected she was biding her time, studying the father and children in hopes of an advantage. In the center of the settlement, the herald oversaw the morning's labor. He was a lean man, his face lined by sun and hardship, yet there was a quiet resolve in his bearing. From dawn until dusk, he walked among the watchers, guiding them to share resources, settle disputes, and fortify their outposts. Each evening, he led a small procession to the nest's boundary, leaving offerings of water, fruit, and salted meat for Drogon and the growing dragons. Sometimes he spoke in low, solemn tones, perhaps entreating the father for continued protection. This morning, the herald paused at the edge of a newly erected stockade, watching the watchers hoist timbers to secure the top. He glanced anxiously toward the mountain pass. Rumors had reached them that more raiders prowled the region, not just petty brigands but disciplined mercenaries. The last raid had ended in flames, courtesy of Drogon's wrath, but men who survived that night would not easily give up. They would bring heavier weapons, sharper blades. The herald's gaze flicked between the pass and the distant silhouette of Drogon perched above, as if weighing their odds. Then, exhaling, he moved on to encourage a group of watchers preparing a shipment of trade goods. Medicinal herbs, goat hides, even small crafted idols in the shape of dragons that had begun to sell among traveling merchants. A faint roar echoed. High in the nest, Drogon rose to his full height, stretching his wings like a banner across the sky. The watchers halted in mid-task, turning their faces upward. Even after so many weeks, the sight of that colossal creature commanded absolute attention. The hatchlings scurried around his forelegs, chirping in excitement. A moment later, Drogon launched himself into the air. The wind of his takeoff flung dust across the settlement and rattled the rickety wood fences. People gasped, half in admiration, half in fear. He soared in a wide circle above the valley, scanning for threats or game. After ensuring no immediate danger lurked among the surrounding crags, he swooped low and glided off in search of prey. The hatchlings watched from the ledge, squawking with frustration at being left behind. Though they could manage short flights, they were not yet capable of the extended journey Drogon routinely took. Their father had begun limiting their food from the Watcher's gifts, urging them to develop the instincts to hunt wild. Instinct alone would not be enough to feed them if they remained reliant on men's tribute. But for now, they remained too small to venture out alone. With Drogon gone, the Watchers resumed their tasks. Several children, emboldened by the father's absence, crept closer to the nest's boundary to peer at the hatchlings. The black-scaled one, largest of the brood, hissed and spread its half-formed wings in a show of challenge. Two other hatchlings joined in, as if to ward off potential intruders. Yet no Watchers dared cross the invisible line that separated them. The memory of Drogon's flames was enough to deter the boldest spirit. Near midday, the heat grew oppressive, shimmering waves rising from the bare rock. Most Watchers sought shade beneath canopies or inside tents. The woman in the veil, however, took this chance to move about the settlement, conferring with a few caravan merchants who had arrived that morning. Their wagons were covered in bright cloth, stacked with crates. Whispers passed between them. The Watchers, noticing these furtive discussions, could only guess what deals were being made. Some worried that she might be trading in knowledge of the valley's defenses, or worse, knowledge of how to subdue dragons. The herald approached her carefully, offering a polite incline of his head. He spoke with soft firmness, hands gesturing as if warning her to respect the camp's unity. She merely inclined her head in return, her veil swaying in the hot breeze. None could hear her words, but the tilt of her voice suggested she was not intimidated. The exchange lasted but a few minutes before she turned away, returning to her pavilion with measured steps. The herald stood there, shoulders tense, as if bracing for the storm he feared was coming. The hush of afternoon descended, broken occasionally by the cry of a goat or the clang of someone hammering nails. The hatchlings sprawled in the shade of a large rock, panting in the heat. Their tongues lolled out, small puffs of smoke escaping when they grunted. They were bored. Without Drogon to guide their hunts, they merely circled the nest and occasionally squabbled among themselves over bits of leftover bones. At times, they eyed the Watchers below, still uncertain how to react to the crowds gathered in the valley. Eventually, Drogon returned in a thunderous flurry of wings. Two large stags clutched in his talons. He landed near the nest, dust whirling around him. The hatchlings erupted in squeals, rushing forward to claim their meal. With a slash of his claws, Drogon ripped chunks from the carcasses, distributing them. The Watchers on the perimeter looked on, half in revulsion, half in fascination at the brutality of the meal. Bits of meat spattered the rocks, and the hatchlings gulped down scraps, their sharp teeth clicking against bone. A hush fell across the camp. As always, whenever father and children fed, the last scraps devoured, Drogon raised his head. Blood streaked his jaw, droplets falling to the stone. He swung his gaze toward the settlement. The Watchers hurried to show their reverence, bowing or kneeling, though it was often unclear whether their gesture sprang from genuine devotion or raw terror. Perhaps in this place, the two emotions were one and the same. As dusk neared, the shadows lengthened. The Watchers lit their torches and cookfires. A gentle wind picked up, ruffling tents and stirring the smoke from campfires into spirals that drifted skyward. The ring of torches around the nest's boundary began to glow, small flickers dancing across the darkening rocks. The hatchlings, newly fed, grew restless, chasing one another about, snapping tails, and squeaking in mock fights. Occasionally, one tried to flutter onto a higher ledge, though their wings were not quite ready for sustained flight. From the barricade came a shout. The watchers turned, hearts pounding, suspecting another band of raiders. But when the lookout signaled, the tension eased. They recognized a small band of travelers, battered and dusty, approaching from the north. The gate swung open cautiously, letting them inside. About a dozen people stumbled through, half-starved, their faces sunburned and haunted. They had no wagons, no goods, only ragged clothes and half-empty water skins. The watchers rushed forward with aid, ladling water, offering scraps of food. These newcomers sank to their knees, grateful. The herald arrived and knelt to speak with them. Their voices, cracked by thirst, told of another settlement to the north, sacked by a ruthless warlord who called himself the Scorpion Lord. He commanded men armed with cunning crossbows, and rumor had it he paid smiths to forge massive bolts capable of felling any beast. They had torched farms and driven families into the wilderness. The newcomers had wandered for days, following rumors of a guardian dragon rumored to protect the weak. Some watchers glanced at each other, alarmed. They remembered too well the contraptions used to wound Rhaegal and kill Viserion in the wars across the Narrow Sea. If the old stories were true, the herald conferred with his closest allies. Anxious whispers spread. Was this warlord's approach inevitable? What if these new arrivals led trouble right to the valley? The watchers felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gathering darkness. For all Drogon's might, they feared an organized force armed with scorpions, catapults, or more lethal contrivances might succeed where mere raiders had failed. Night fell swiftly, a blanket of stars appearing overhead. In the flicker of firelight, the settlement braced itself. Men stood guard at the barricades, scanning the darkness for shapes that might herald an attack. Women soothed children, telling them that the Black Dragon would protect them. But no one truly slept easily that night. There was a collective sense of hearts beating faster, aware that the world beyond the valley was stirring, drawn by the rumor of dragons. Up at the nest, Drogon felt that same tension in the air. He prowled the perimeter, occasionally flaring his wings at shadows or faint sounds from below. The hatchlings, too, sensed the charged atmosphere, fussing among themselves, until at last they piled together in a trembling knot. As the moon rose, pale light washing the valley in silver, Drogon finally settled, tail curling around his brood, protective as a fortress wall. He listened to the hum of distant night insects, the faint moans of exhausted travelers. In his reptilian mind, he did not weigh the politics of mortal men, but he recognized danger. Morning came with a swirl of dust on a stiff breeze from the north. A tense quiet reigned across the settlement. Armed watchers patrolled the walls. Merchants and travelers who had come seeking profit or spectacle now eyed the main gate, debating whether to leave before war's shadow arrived. But they feared traveling alone, lest they meet bandits on the roads or wander too close to the rumored army. So they stayed, pinned by caution. Drogon hunted that day, returning at intervals to feed the hatchlings. The watchers, uneasy with rumors, spent more time fashioning crude weapons. Some hammered scraps of metal into arrowheads. Others sharpened wooden stakes or tried to form small catapults from wagon parts. Their craftsmanship was rudimentary, the results questionable. Yet the will to defend their newfound home burned in them. The settlement had become more than a way station. It was a sanctuary, forged by the presence of dragons. The Veil Lady watched these preparations from the shade of her pavilion. Now and then, she beckoned watchers over. They emerged carrying bundles of metallic rods, lengths of chain, or other contraptions. She appeared to be building something in secret. The watchers, unsettled, whispered about these deliveries. One by one they brought her supplies she'd purchased at steep prices. Black powder rumored to come from Yait bellows, thick plates of hammered iron. Whenever the herald tried to inquire, she politely deflected, claiming it was merely a personal project to protect her goods should raiders return. But the watchers had grown wary. Days passed in uneasy routine. The hatchlings grew still larger. Their wings, once frail, now flapped with surprising force. The black one practiced gliding from the upper ledge to the valley floor, spooking watchers who came too close. Although it could not yet gain altitude on its own, it could manage a controlled drop. One afternoon, it landed near the barricade, scattering terrified watchers. then hissed at a pen of goats. The father, from his vantage atop the nest, roared, commanding the black hatchling to return. Chastened, it scrambled back, half flying, half hopping. The watchers laughed nervously afterward, relieved that Drogon had recalled his child before it devoured the camp's livestock. Yet an undercurrent of fear rippled among them. What if, in time, the young dragons roamed at will, ignoring their father's calls? Could the watchers survive the curiosity and appetites of 7 growing dragons? Doubt etched itself into the edges of their daily life. One evening, the settlement was busy finishing the day's tasks when the alarm rang out again from the lookout post. A plume of dust rose from the northern pass. Figures emerged, a line of travelers or warriors trudging along the rocky trail. The watchers feared another band of raiders. Weapons were readied. The rickety catapults were dragged into position. The settlement braced for another assault. But as the figures drew nearer, the watchers saw they were refugees, families in tattered clothing, carrying children and what few possessions they had left. Their leader, a woman with scarred arms, approached the barricade, her face drawn with exhaustion. They called out for shelter, for water. The watchers sighed in relief, though their hearts grew heavier with each passing group of desperate souls. The story was always the same. A ruthless warlord ravaging the countryside, driving people before him like cattle. They had come seeking the dragon's protection. The herald allowed them entry, distributing what aid the settlement could spare. Over the next few days, more groups straggled in, forming a makeshift camp outside the settlement's walls. Tents of ragged cloth sprouted across the dusty ground. Children wailed for food. Mothers wept silently. Fathers stared numbly at the horizon. The watchers felt their resources strained. They struggled to feed themselves, let alone these new arrivals. Many turned to the father of dragons, glancing up at Drogon's distant shape, as though hoping he might conjure a miracle. Amid this influx of refugees, quiet voices asked if the father of dragons would lead them to war. Perhaps, they whispered, he could fly north and unleash his fire upon this warlord's army, scouring them from the land. Others hesitated, recalling that men with scorpions were no idle threat. The watchers had seen Drogon triumphant against small foes, but what if an entire army waited, armed with bolts that could pierce scale? The hush in the camp deepened as nights grew restless. One dusk, the herald climbed the slope toward the nest, alone. He had come before, at a respectful distance, but rarely so close. He carried a small bundle of cloth, and in it, a slender staff topped with a curved blade. It was an ancient symbol from his homeland, possibly a relic, though battered. He paused a dozen paces from where Drogon lay coiled with the hatchlings. The dragons hissed, but Drogon did not move to attack. He recognized this man's scent, the one who had offered him tributes and maintained order among the watchers. The herald knelt, pressing his forehead to the ground. Then he rose, holding up the staff, speaking in soft, urgent tones. He gestured to the refugees below, to the ragged tents, then pointed north. His voice trembled with a mix of hope and desperation. Finally, he pressed a hand to his chest, as though pleading. Drogon's black eyes narrowed. He listened to the tone, the heartbreak in the man's voice. He did not understand the words, but he sensed the entreaty. The father of dragons shifted his wings, rising to loom over the herald. Smoke curled from his nostrils as he tilted his head, exhaling a rumbling growl. The herald flinched but did not flee. Instead he bowed again, tears streaking his dust-caked cheeks, continuing to speak as if trying to convey the depth of his plea. The hatchlings hissed in curiosity, craning their necks to watch. After a tense moment, Drogon stepped forward, a single clawed foot crashing down near the herald. Dust billowed up. The man did not budge, though terror glistened in his eyes. Drogon's massive head lowered, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the slender staff the herald offered. A memory stirred in the dragon's mind, a recollection of a silver-haired queen holding aloft a staff in a foreign city, demanding an end to cruelty. Echoes of Daenerys' voice drifted through him. He let out a roar that rocked the stones, then spread his wings in a sudden motion. The herald toppled backward, the staff slipping from his hands. The watchers at the base of the slope shouted in alarm. some rushing forward but stopping short when Drogon roared again. At last, the herald scrambled to his feet and bowed, understanding that the father would not destroy him yet. In trembling steps, he retreated, leaving the staff in the dust. Drogon snorted a plume of smoke, gazing after the man. The watchers, seeing that their herald had survived, breathed ragged sighs of relief, but tension remained. No one knew if Drogon understood the plea to intervene against the approaching threat. Perhaps all he cared about was safeguarding his brood and lair. The watchers found themselves consumed by doubt. On the next morning, the woman in the veil emerged from her pavilion wearing ceremonial robes. Embroidered dragons in gold thread rippled across the fabric. She carried a slender metal container inlaid with turquoise and lapis. Her sellsword guards accompanied her. She strode to the settlement's center, beckoning watchers to gather. The herald arrived, expression grim, and kept one hand on the hilt of a blade. She began to speak, her voice resonant. Those watchers who understood the dialect gasped. Whispers darted through the throng. She was proposing a pact, offering knowledge of how to forge stronger weaponry, perhaps even something to stand against the rumored scorpion bolts. In exchange, she wanted a closer relationship with the dragons, a formal right to approach the nest, to learn their habits and study them. Many watchers balked, shaking their heads. They had seen Drogon's rage at her attempts to dabble with colored flames. Others were so desperate for protection that they wavered. The herald stepped forward, refusing her proposal in measured tones. She arched an eyebrow behind her veil, countering with the suggestion that if they continued to do nothing, the valley would fall once a true army arrived. Did they think the Black Dragon would care about their plight beyond defending his own offspring? Murmurs of uncertainty spread among the crowd. She pressed her advantage, offering glimpses of her container's contents. Small devices of twisted steel, flasks of tar-like substances, pieces of intricate clockwork. She claimed these could be turned into a form of artillery capable of launching heavy bolts, or perhaps harnessing dragonfire itself. The herald's eyes flicked from the strange devices to the watchers' worried faces. He could sense their desperation, yet trusting her felt like a gamble with unknown consequences. Tension crackled in the air as a few watchers murmured support for her plan, while others insisted they trust Drogon alone. The woman's tone sharpened, accusing the herald of risking everyone's lives by clinging to blind faith in a beast that neither shared their language nor cared for their survival. She called him naive, pointing to the meager defenses around the settlement. A dozen watchers turned away, unwilling to hear more, but others lingered, enthralled by the idea of harnessing greater power. The crowd fractured into small knots of argument. Some demanded the herald accept her proposal, at least in part, urging him to let her build improved catapults or scorpion-like ballistae. Others insisted that forging weapons that threatened dragons was an unholy betrayal of the father's protection. Behind the throng, a child screamed in alarm. The watchers spun to see that a pair of hatchlings had descended from the nest, gliding awkwardly down to the settlement's edge. They landed in a swirl of dust, snapping at a stray goat. Instantly, watchers rushed to shoo them away, brandishing sticks, though none dared strike. The hatchlings bared fangs, hissed, and coughed tiny gouts of flame. Goats bleated, stampeding across the camp. The woman in the veil seized on the moment, pointing to the chaos and exclaiming that such creatures were inherently dangerous, that they needed management or control. She brandished her container as if it held a solution. The herald turned a furious glare on her, then rushed to help watchers herd the goats away from the young dragons. Meanwhile, above, Drogon roared in warning, telling his offspring to return. One of the hatchlings hissed in defiance, but turned, half flying back up the slope. The other, a mottled bronze, lingered, snapping at a goat that had stumbled. Only when Drogon's roar thundered again did it begrudgingly spread its wings and leap away, leaving a trembling goat bleeding in the dust. The watchers steadied themselves, hearts pounding. The woman in the veil pivoted, addressing them with a triumphant edge in her voice. "See," she said, "even the father's brood poses a threat to you. You must ally with me. I can ensure that the dragons remain a boon, not a nightmare." The camp erupted in worried debate. Some watchers demanded the herald come up with a better plan, or at least glean a compromise. Others clamored to reject her, fearful of meddling in dragon affairs. The herald, face tight with stress, raised his hands for silence. He declared that they must respect the father's dominion. Without Drogon's might, the settlement would already have fallen to the raiders. He assured them that in time the father might defend them, even against the rumored warlord. They had built their home on faith that dragons could bring hope, not simply havoc. The watchers gradually quieted, though unease rippled beneath the surface. The woman in the veil scoffed, calling them fools. She snatched up her container and strode away, returning to her pavilion. A few watchers followed, perhaps to negotiate in private, perhaps drawn by the idea of harnessing her cunning devices. The rest drifted apart, uncertain how to proceed, glancing anxiously at the nest above. In the weeks to come, they knew they must either unify or risk disintegrating when the first sign of a real army approached. Days blurred into nights. More refugees arrived, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. They brought fresh horror stories: entire villages butchered, farmland burned, children taken by slavers in the chaos. The watchers braced for the inevitable. They busied themselves with reinforcing their walls and constructing new watchtowers. The father soared overhead, majestic and remote, while the 7 hatchlings skittered around the nest, practicing flight on gusty afternoons. One dawn, watchers spotted movement along the northern ridges. They readied weapons, calling to one another in hushed alarm. But no warband marched into view. Instead, a lone figure came, robed in black. He wore no armor, and his face was gaunt, eyes sunk deep in shadow. He bore a staff wrapped in cloth. Behind him crept a donkey pulling a small cart. The watchers aimed arrows, unsure of his intent. He raised both hands, calling out in an oddly resonant voice. He came in peace, he said, to deliver a warning. The watchers let him approach with caution. The donkey's hooves clopped wearily, the cart rattling over stones. Inside the cart were old tomes, scrolls, and a few battered chests. When asked who he was, the newcomer claimed to be a scholar of old Valyrian lore, a collector of knowledge about dragons and their history. He had traveled far, drawn by rumors of the father and his brood, and also by the whispers of a looming warlord. The watchers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to trust him. He asked permission to meet with their herald. The watchers reluctantly guided him through the settlement, ignoring or mocking his donkey's bray. People parted, eyeing the robed figure with suspicion. He bowed upon meeting the herald, then spoke quietly about the texts he carried. Ancient treatises on draconic physiology, old rites used by Valyrian dragon lords, the notes of travelers who had glimpsed the dune's aftermath. He claimed these might hold clues to protecting the father and his brood from siege engines or poisons that men might deploy. The herald listened, intrigued yet wary. Why offer such knowledge freely? The scholar insisted that the resurgence of dragons was a miracle that must be preserved. He had no desire for profit, only to ensure the mistakes of the past were not repeated. When the herald questioned him about the warlord to the north, the scholar's face darkened. Rumor held that the warlord's blacksmiths were forging barbed bolts the size of spears, with tips coated in a poison gleaned from the deep desert. A single well-placed shot could cripple a dragon. The watchers sucked in sharp breaths, remembering the tragedies once inflicted on Daenerys' children by such devices. The scholar proposed a solution. If the watchers would grant him access to the father and brood, he might glean how to strengthen the dragon's natural armor. In old accounts, certain diets or substances in their environment had bolstered a dragon's scales and improved fire-breathing capacity. The watchers looked to the herald for guidance. He weighed the scholar's words against the risk of letting a stranger near the dragons. At length, the herald replied that the father was not a beast to be studied like a specimen in a pen. If Drogon did not wish to let the scholar approach, no mortal force could compel it. The watchers themselves would not dare. Still, if the scholar believed he could glean knowledge from a distance, perhaps the father would allow that. The scholar nodded, accepting the terms. In the following days, the scholar set up a modest camp near the nest's boundary. He pored over scrolls, occasionally venturing out to gather local herbs or examine the rock formations that emitted sulfurous vapors. Some watchers grew fascinated, peeking over his shoulder as he scribbled notes in a cramped script. He was patient, explaining that in Valyria, dragons had thrived among volcanic vents rich in minerals. He wondered if the father's presence in this valley was no accident. Perhaps Drogon had been guided by instincts leading him to a place that mirrored the lost homeland of his ancestors. Meanwhile, the black hatchling began to show signs of dominance among its siblings. It frequently snapped at the others over food or vantage points, hissing them away from the best sunning spots. Drogon intervened only when violence threatened to injure a hatchling severely. The Watchers recognized that among dragons, a certain hierarchy was natural, forging strength through constant challenges. But they could not help but worry that as these young beasts grew, they might turn that aggression outward. Tensions remained high in the settlement. The Veil Lady continued her private machinations, collecting strange materials. The scholar's arrival unnerved her, and Watchers whispered that she cursed under her breath whenever she passed his tent. She would not be overshadowed by some dusty lorekeeper claiming the keys to draconic power. Still, she bided her time, maintaining an outward politeness, even gifting him a sample of pungent oil said to be used by Carthene priests in fire ritual. He accepted it with a guarded smile, uncertain of her motives. All the while the father soared above them, a black sentinel scanning the plains. Whenever a fresh wave of refugees arrived, he flew lower, his roar echoing as if to ward off pursuers. None came yet, but each passing day brought rumors that the warlord's forces were gathering, subjugating settlements, building siege engines. Whispers circulated that the warlord had gained a sponsor, some wealthy ally from across the seas. Wild speculation flourished. Perhaps it was an enemy of the Targaryen line, or a Braavosi consortium that feared the return of dragons. Fact or rumor, the Watchers could not be sure. At night, the scholar's lamplight glimmered near the nest, where he sketched the hatchlings' silhouettes whenever they ventured close enough for observation. He studied the way they tested their newly forming fangs on rocks, how they scraped the ground with their claws in a manner reminiscent of nesting behaviors. He marveled at the faint glow in their eyes when they displayed aggression, scribbling notes about how it might reflect an inherited magical trait from old Valyria. One quiet midnight, he was awakened by the echo of flapping wings. The black-scaled hatchling had half glided down to a spot close to his tent, perhaps drawn by the rustle of parchment or the smell of exotic oils. The scholar froze, heart pounding, as the young dragon sniffed at his crates. Slitted eyes glinted in the moonlight. Drool spattered on the ground, sizzling slightly from the heat in its throat. The scholar held his breath, praying the hatchling would not burn everything. A low growl issued from behind them. Drogon descended, overshadowing both man and hatchling. The father hissed, and the black hatchling squeaked defiantly, but stepped away from the scholar's tent. Drogon rumbled in clear warning, smoke curling from his nostrils. The scholar dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to the dirt, hoping to show submission. Slowly, the father snorted, turning back to the slope. The black hatchling followed, tail lashing in annoyance. The scholar exhaled shakily, grateful to be alive. In the flicker of dying firelight, he realized that if he were to glean anything more, he must do it from a safer distance. The father's patience had limits. He jotted down a note. Young black exhibits extra curiosity, potential symbol of alpha behavior. Father still tolerant, but protective. Then he turned in for the night, listening to the faint roar of the brood echo across the valley. Dawn arrived with a promise of trouble. A ragged scout, exhausted from running, reached the barricade, shouting that he had seen an armed column perhaps 2 days' march from the valley. He wore the tatters of a once proud banner, now stained with dust and blood. He claimed the warlord's men advanced steadily, led by rank upon rank of crossbowmen, steel-tipped bolts glinting in the sun. At their rear, wagons rumbled with pieces of heavy machinery. The Watchers gathered, hearts pounding. The threat was no longer rumor. It was reality. Frantic discussion ensued. Some Watchers cried out to flee, to gather what they could and vanish before the invaders arrived. Others argued that they had nowhere to go. This valley was their only refuge. They turned eyes to the nest, whispering that the father must fight for them. that the brood could rain down fire. The herald tried to calm them, but panic simmered. If the father turned away, or if their defenses proved inadequate, they would all be slaughtered or enslaved. Amid the chaos, the Veiled Lady stepped forward, unveiling her plan. She spoke boldly of her devices, new war machines that could match the warlord's siege engines. She gestured for her henchmen to roll forth a contraption covered in tarps. The watchers gasped when they saw it. A cumbersome metal frame studded with iron plates, a pivoting arm like a catapult, and an array of odd tubes. She called it a dragon lance, claiming it could harness flames, launching fire-soaked bolts or perhaps igniting swaths of the battlefield. She boasted that with a little more time, she could construct several of these wonders. The watchers gawked, uncertain if such a machine was a miracle or a disaster waiting to happen. The scholar looked on with deep suspicion. He questioned her design, the safety of storing combustible materials near the settlement, the risk of misfires that might burn them all alive. She dismissed him coldly, accusing him of lacking practical courage. The herald intervened, demanding a demonstration to prove her invention would not harm the father or his brood. The woman paused, reluctant to reveal too much. She insisted that it was meant to repel ground forces, not to harm dragons. The watchers pressed her, worried that the father might perceive the machine as a threat. At last, under the herald's firm gaze, she relented. She led them outside the barricade, choosing a large patch of open ground. A few watchers helped set up the contraption, attaching a metal canister to the pivoting arm. She directed them to load a small wooden target some distance away. The watchers stood well back, fearful. With a turn of a wheel, she aimed the device. Then she pulled a lever. A plume of liquid fire erupted from the canister, arcing through the air. It struck the target, exploding in a burst of flames that clung like tar. The watchers gasped at the ferocity of the blaze. Thick black smoke curled skyward. Even the herald stood in stunned silence. The woman gestured triumphantly. See how quickly it could incinerate enemy lines. She promised that with a half-dozen of these, the settlement might stand a chance against a conventional force. But the watchers saw the spilled droplets of fire that ignited the ground in erratic patches. They smelled the acrid stench and felt the residual heat. One miscalculation, and their own walls could go up in flames. And what of the father? If he saw such a device launch fire, would he interpret it as an attack? The watchers murmured among themselves, torn between the fear of an approaching army and the fear of angering the Black Dragon. Night found the settlement in turmoil. The Veiled Lady tried to rally support to build more dragon lances. She claimed her knowledge was their only salvation. The scholar begged caution, urging the watchers to trust in the father's strength and to consider the possibility of fortifying the dragons themselves, as Valyrians once did, perhaps outfitting them with protective scales or harnesses. But that too seemed far-fetched, requiring the father's consent, which no mortal could guarantee. The herald called an assembly by torchlight, summoning all major voices: caravans, pilgrims, refugees, the Veiled Lady, and the scholar. Tensions flared, voices raised, accusations were hurled. One group insisted they begin building the contraptions at once. Another demanded they petition Drogon more directly, perhaps offering him a great pyre that might stoke his power, hoping he would sense their plea to fight. A third faction insisted on fleeing, convinced that neither the father nor any mortal device could repel an entire army. A heavy silence clung to the group when they realized no single plan could satisfy them all. The herald closed his eyes, then spoke with measured sadness. He declared that in 2 days, if no solution arose, those who wished to flee could gather supplies and depart. Those who wished to remain and fight would do so. He then asked the watchers to remember their bonds, for the father had saved them once. He might do so again, but fear was a powerful enemy that could unravel their fragile unity. So the meeting ended in a weary hush. The watchers drifted away to argue in smaller circles. The Veiled Lady glided back to her pavilion, flanked by guards. The scholar retired to his tent, brow furrowed in worried thought. The settlement's torches flickered in the darkness, revealing the lines of anxious faces. Far above, perched on his rocky ledge, Drogon watched, eyes gleaming red in the firelight. The hatchling stirred at his side, sensing the tension that seeped up from below. They could not understand the words, only the fear that clung to the camp like a shroud. Wind swept through the valley, carrying dust and the faint tang of sulfur from hidden vents. Stars glittered overhead, oblivious to mortal concerns. In the hush of night, some watchers pressed their palms together in prayer, invoking the old gods or the new gods. Others sharpened swords they barely knew how to wield. A few prepared their wagons, quietly deciding to slip away before dawn. None knew what daybreak would bring, only that a storm was gathering beyond the horizon. And above them all, the father of dragons stretched his wings, letting the moonlight caress each black scale. He felt the quiet stirring in his brood, 7 young hearts beating with the fire of possibility. The royal of danger in the air reminded him of battles past, of scorching iron thrones and city walls. Dawn was near, and soon the dragons would face the true test of whether the rebirth of their kind would herald new glory or plunge them all into fresh tragedy. The watchers prayed that the Father's flame would guide them, while below, men plotted, machines were built, and armies drew closer with every step. In that fraught silence, the future of a valley, perhaps of an entire land, hung by a single tenuous thread of dragonfire.